welcome to Gladney University. We're super excited to have you here with us today. Just a few things before we get started. After the presentation, you will receive a pop-up where you can fill this out if you need a certificate of completion or CEUs. And these do take about 5 to 7 business days to get back to you. So just be patient with us on that. If you, for some reason, don't get the pop-up link, you will receive an email tomorrow and you can fill out that same information then. And as always, if you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat and we'll make sure that Adam gets to them for you. Hi, Marina. Good morning. That is all. We are super excited to do our Gladney short stacks. This is kind of a new idea that we're trying out, and we're very thankful for Adam for being our first speaker on it. So without further ado, Adam, I'll let you take it from here.
All right. Thank you so much, Ashley. I really appreciate being here with you all and giving this new format a try. It's going to be new for me too, doing all of this in 30 minutes. So what I've tried to do is to try to pull out what I think is the most important content on each of these 3 topics. And I'm going to do my best to get through each of them fairly quickly. And I'll try to leave about 5 minutes at the end of each one so that we can kind of do a check-in and a Q&A, get any questions that you have answered, and then kind of move on to the next one if that works for everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen shared here. So the first one that I've got, or at least I hope I have up for you all, is my screen showing okay, Ashley? Trauma-informed connection?
Yes, it looks
okay,
good.
Perfect. So the first one I've got is one that I think is especially relevant today. It's always been relevant for child welfare professionals, social workers. I was looking through the list of as you all were sharing some of the agencies and some of the roles that you have, and I think it'll be especially helpful for you all. Now, I also know that everybody's been in workshops that address issues of burnout and secondary trauma and self-care. So I've tried to organize this in a way that it's hopefully a little bit different in terms of the content that you get. Many of you are familiar with Bruce Perry, and I'll actually address Dr. Bruce Perry's work in just about all 3 of our lectures, probably multiple times today. But many of you know that he has authored a new book called What Happened to You? And in that book, he talks so much about the importance of connection and relationships and boundaries and self-care in our work with children and individuals who have, and families who have dealt with a lot of trauma and a lot of adversity. And so I've tried to work with that a little bit and maybe bring it to life for us in terms of our addressing our own needs and address some of the incredible neuroscience that exists now. One of my passions on the fact, as a social worker at St. Edward's is to, really keep up with the latest in behavioral neuroscience and just all the incredible work that's being done, especially as it relates to trauma, and to try to bring it to life and make it meaningful to frontline professionals and social workers and caseworkers and educators. So my hope is that we can do that with all of these today, but especially with this first one. And so I thought there was probably no better way to start than with a good Bruce Perry quote. And if you're not familiar with who Bruce Perry is, I would, and I know most people are, but if you're not, I would really encourage you to look him up and look up his work. He's the author of an incredibly well-known book. It's one of my favorites. I taught from it for about 12 years now. It's called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. More recently, he co-authored a book with Oprah Winfrey entitled What Happened to You? But he's a child psychiatrist and a behavioral neuroscientist, and has just done some incredible work in what he does. I think better than anybody else is he takes this incredible science, much of this research that he's done in his labs, and he really brings it life, and he explains it in a way that it has so much meaning for both survivors of trauma, folks who've dealt with a lot of adversity, and for those individuals who are working to help them to heal from that. And he has this quote in his newest book, and it says, "Relationships matter. The currency for systemic change is trust, and trust comes through forming healthy working relationships. It's people, not programs, that change people." And he uses this, of course, as a, to talk about how ultimately to heal from trauma, right? And he does work with children, right? To heal from trauma, There's so many things that are so important, right? We talk about structure in safety and predictability and in therapy and counseling and in emotional regulation and all of these things, which we know are so vital and so important to healing from trauma and adversity and disconnection for children. But he talks too about how more and more research is coming out that has him convinced that ultimately the most important thing to healing from trauma and adversity are relationships. And if we think about that, I know many of you have done a lot of work on attachment. And don't worry, this isn't going to be a lecture that's all about attachment theory. I'm not going to bore you out here, but there's some important relevance here. If you think about, when a baby is born, my cousin just had a little baby a couple months back. And when that baby was born, a baby gets their pleasure from having their needs met, right? When they're hungry, somebody's there to feed them. When they're upset, somebody's there to soothe them. When they need their diaper changed, somebody's there to change them, right? And somebody's there to rock them and to hold them and to do all of those things. And ultimately, what happens early on in that baby's life is they get, especially as they're much more simple people and their brains are more simple, right? Is they get their pleasure from simply having those needs met. And they're not particularly concerned or care too much about who is meeting those needs, right? When you go to, I was joking with my wife about this the other day. We have five kids, most of them teenagers now. But when they were little, when we had that first one, I remember we had our first baby, and the nurse came in and said, "We can take the baby from you guys for a little bit so you could get a rest, and you can get some rest." And we thought, no, we want to hold her and rock her, and why would we want somebody else to take her? And by the time we had our fifth kid, I remember asking, like, when's somebody going to come around and give us a rest here, right? But babies, they don't mind. It could be nurses, it could be strangers, right? They don't care as long as they're being rocked and soothed and held and changed. They're okay. But what happens early on, right, in their brain's formation, right? The brain is a meaning-making machine, right? Bruce Perry talks about that a lot, right? You're trying to make sense of your world, right? And what happens is there's a fundamental shift there. And a baby's pleasure doesn't come so much from simply having those needs met, being changed, rocked, soothed, and fed, but it comes from the very people who are meeting those needs, right? Typically their caregivers, their parents, their grandparents, whoever those individuals are, right? And they get their greatest sense of pleasure, their greatest sense of joy from being in connection with those people. And that's one of the most important, right, experiences that a child has in a major connection, is being made there for them. And I promise this is going to have major relevance to burnout in self-care here in a second. That their pleasure comes from relationships. Ultimately, it is their greatest pleasure that comes from relationships, right? There's nothing else. And if there's anything that we've learned in the course of the last 2 years as we navigate this pandemic, and I was just thinking as I was logging on, that when I did some trainings for Gladney last summer, it was still a pretty rough time in the pandemic. We were still kind of in the midst of it. It was a much more difficult time for us. But for a lot of us, we realized, as we became more disconnected, as we became isolated from our colleagues and our coworkers and our friends and even some of our family members, especially in those really bad times during the pandemic, right? We realized that was our greatest sense of our pleasure comes from people. Our pleasure comes from relationships. There's no amount of Amazon packages, right, that could make up for that sense of connection with being with our friends and our family and our colleagues and our coworkers and the people that mean a lot to us. And all of that goes back to that basic, those basic developmental experiences. The other thing that as it relates to development that I'll talk about very quickly, and we're going to look at this on a different scale here in a little bit, is that, and we all kind of know this, you remember this when you took attachment classes or child development classes, but when a child is born, effectively what is happening is their brain starts to wire for the world that they're going to live in. And so let's imagine here that we have two kids, and the first kid is born into a world where all of those needs are met, and they have parents and grandparents and neighbors and coworkers who are all there to hold them and to rock them and to feed them and to love them, right? That baby is going to wire for a world, meaning their brain is quite literally going to activate the systems in their brains to navigate a world where their needs are met, where relationships and connection are so important, where they're safe, right? In their brains are going to activate the systems based upon that template, that world, right? It's going to wire for the world that they're going to live in. Now, if we have another baby over here and they're born into a world that's really chaotic, maybe there's a lot of poverty or homelessness or a lack of attachment or even some trauma, domestic violence, those sorts of things. What's going to happen? Their brain's going to do the exact same thing. It's going to wire for a world where, right, those basic needs aren't going to be met by the people who love them. They're going to have to meet those needs on their own, and they're not safe. They're good. So they're going to wire for a world that's not safe. And maybe they're going to wire for a world where connection in relationships, right, are not something that are as important. And so when we talk here in a little bit about self-care and we talk about burnout, one of the things that we know from the neuroscience is just about every day, our brain does that for us based upon the template that we give it. The experiences and the expectations and the stress and the trauma and the workload, right? And in all of the challenges that we deal with in life and in work. Every day, based upon that template, our brain decides these are the systems that we need to activate to survive and to thrive in a world where there's a lot of stress and a lot of trauma, and there's much more expected of us than we have to give, and there's a lot of chaos and a lot of tension and toxicity and in all of those sorts of things, as opposed to, right, the brain wiring for a world where, yeah, sure, there's stress. Or all of I was looking at the work that you all do, right? There's a ton of stress in all of that work, right? But if we have those boundaries and we're doing a lot to take care of ourselves, it's a completely different experience. And I want to break that down for us here in a little bit. Here's some data on secondary trauma. I'm not going to spend too much time on this in burnout. And most of us probably to some degree are already somewhat familiar with some of this data here, but about 50% of mental health professionals report moderate levels or high levels of burnout. Mental health professionals especially are amongst the highest of any discipline out there when it comes to burnout and obviously secondary trauma. Social workers' average ACE scores, and of course, adverse childhood experiences are those experiences that we have in childhood typically related to trauma, things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, having an incarcerated parent, having a parent with a major mental health issue, having a parent dealing with major substance abuse, domestic violence. And we know that those ACEs are tied to more adverse mental health, behavioral health, and overall general health outcomes in adulthood. But social workers on average have significantly higher ACE scores, a lot more childhood adversity. We could do a whole nother short stack training on why social work has so many folks who have so much trauma and so much adversity, especially rooted in their childhood. And we know that MSSW level social workers are about twice as likely to meet criteria for PTSD than the general population. And so then we want to look at why, right? Why are these rates so high, especially these rates of secondary traumatic stress amongst helping professionals, social workers, caseworkers, adoption workers, educators? I'm sure if we looked at some of this data with teachers, it would be fairly similar. And especially given some of the, where I saw the last person, I think it was Linda, that logged on there, says, oh, I'm a crisis counselor, right? Somebody else, I work in adoption. Somebody else, I work, foster care, family crisis. When we work in these fields, domestic violence, child welfare, I talk about this with CPS all the time, right? It's important to recognize that we're not wired for this level of stress. Right. When we think about stress, there's acute stress, right, which we typically used to call big T trauma. And then there's chronic stress, what we used to call little t trauma. And the reason we don't do that anymore is that we realized over time that this chronic stress can have just as adverse of an impact on somebody as that acute stress, what used to be called the large T, big T stress, right? And so we're wired for stress in two ways, and there's going to be relevance in all three of our workshops today for this, but we're wired for stress that one first meets a certain threshold, and once an experience maxes that threshold, a trauma, domestic violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, combat trauma, some sexual assault, right? Those are all acute stressors. We're not wired for that level of stress. It becomes a lower order experience, right? A fight or flight experience. In the same way that we're only wired for stress that meets a certain threshold, we're also only wired for stress that is temporary. We're not wired for ongoing stress, right? Things like homelessness, chronic poverty, migrant refugee kids living in the shadows of with the constant fear of being detained or deported, or their family members being detained or deported. You think of LGBTQI plus youth who live in constant fear of having their identities realized, or fear of family rejection. Those are all chronic stressors, and we're not wired for those. And this is exactly why, if we were to look at brain scans of kids who experience things like childhood sexual abuse and those who deal with like abject poverty or homelessness, those lower order systems look very similar. Those fight or flight stress response systems look very similar. We're not wired for this level of stress. And for a lot of us in social work, especially if we're in a field or an area or a job that has, where we're exposed to a lot of trauma, or we're exposed to a lot of stress, or we have very little control, right, over what happens in the lives of our clients or ourselves, we're just not wired for that level of stress, and it's going to take its toll on us. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit, right? So when we talk, and we'll do that now, right? When we talk about secondary traumatic stress and we talk about burnout, I think it's really important that we understand how this happens, right? Because it's the same thing with trauma. It's one thing to say, hey, kids are experiencing, the families that we work with are experiencing trauma, but it becomes really important. And I think that's what's been so helpful about the Trauma Informed movement, is that it's helped us to really understand a lot more neurobiologically, physiologically, what's going on in the brains and the bodies, right, in the worlds of these children in these families. And I don't think we've done as good of a job of that when we talk about burnout and secondary trauma. I think there are a lot of social workers out there, many who probably know that they're experiencing or have experienced some level of burnout or secondary trauma in the past, or are currently experiencing it now, but who don't really understand or know what's going on inside their brains and inside their bodies. So I want to spend a little bit of time doing that and explain that very briefly here. But Bruce Perry has, talks in Bessel van der Kolk and some of these other folks who've done a lot of trauma work, talk about this dynamic of social and emotional contagion, which basically means that we're contagious to the emotions, right, of the people who we are around, right? We're significantly influenced by the thoughts and the emotions in the experiences. And over time, the more that we're exposed to those, the more that we start to reflect many of those same attributes, right? And for social workers and helping professionals and crisis workers and caseworkers, we spend a lot of time around people, both our clients and our colleagues, who are dealing with a lot of stress, right? And what happens is we begin to absorb some of that stress. This is a model that Bruce Perry uses quite a bit in his teaching, but it kind of explains, that the brain is built, from the bottom up, right? And this is those lower order systems of the brain that are really primitive. And these are the regions or the systems that we utilize when we're under some level of stress or some level of threat. And what he tells us about these systems is that these systems are not very complex. They're not very sophisticated. They're very basic. They're very primitive, so that in the interest of safety, in the interest of speed of time, we access these systems when we're under threat or we're under a lot of stress. But what happens is when we're under, you think about a traumatized child, right? When they're under a lot of stress, they're not accessing these more complex, right, higher level systems, especially way up here, right, the cortex, these sophisticated regions where we make critical connections, we think more clearly, we experience things like pleasure and connection and all of those sorts of things, right? And kind of the hallmark feature of childhood trauma, but also kind of the hallmark feature of burnout and secondary traumatic stress, is that those individuals who are experiencing that are constantly activating and relying upon these lower order systems of the brain, right? And so in the more that we do that, the more that, right, when we wake up in the morning and our brain is deciding what systems we're going to need to survive and thrive and make it in our worlds, right, the more that it's going to activate these lower order systems, because we're saying, right, my world has nothing but stress and toxicity and trauma, right, and there's more expected of me than I have to give, so it's going to stay down here, right? In when we're experiencing a state of distress, what happens is, right, when we're already somewhat dysregulated, when we're already stressed, what happens is that when we experience a stressor, maybe a challenging client, right? A challenging colleague, right? Something like that. What happens is, as we navigate that stressor, it causes us to get more dysregulated than had we encountered that same stressor in a regulated state, right? A lot of us can think about the pandemic. The pandemic gives us a really good lens for looking at a lot of these sorts of things, because we all experience this to some degree. But if you're anything like me, you know that in the midst of the pandemic, a lot of the things that I was experiencing in the midst of the pandemic, stressors that previously, before the pandemic, I typically was able to navigate without getting too stressed or too overwhelmed or too dysregulated, were now causing me all sorts of dysregulation and all sorts of stress. And that was because I was already dysregulated from the stress of the pandemic. And that's exactly what happens if we're already in a state of dysregulation. As we continue to encounter those same stressors, they stress us out more, and they cause more alarm, and they cause us to activate those dysregulated lower order systems a lot more, right? And so this is that upside down triangle, right? That kind of symbolizes how we're supposed to be utilizing these different regions of the brain, right? We're supposed to be really kind of top heavy. The more that we're using these higher order systems, the more clarity, the more connection, the more critically we think, the more affiliations that we make, all connections, all of those sorts of things. These are very sophisticated regions of our brain, and this is where we want to spend our time. Now, we work with clients who they're coming to us because they're stressed, or they've experienced trauma, or they're overwhelmed and they need help. And what happens is they look a little bit more like this. They're bottom heavy, right? They're under a lot of stress, and they're accessing these lower order systems, especially if we're talking about child welfare and domestic violence and in some of these other fields where they're actually under threat. They're accessing, relying almost entirely on these lower order systems because they have to. And what happens is we share our calm, we share our insight, we share our sense of regulation, and we do all the activities, and we hear them, and we listen to them, and we process with them, and we walk with them, and we breathe with them, and we do all of those things. And what happens is, as we do that, and as we share our calm, and we share our sense of regulation, they start to look more like this over here, right? And that's the whole point of what we do, right? As helping professionals, as social workers. But we really do share that. So as we share that calm, as we share that connection, as we share that insight, as we share that empathy, as we share that vulnerability, as we do all of those things, what happens is we start to dysregulate as helping professionals, and we start to look a little bit more like this, or at least some of those higher order regions start to constrict a little bit, and those lower order regions start to expand a little bit, and we're relying more and more on that, right? If that sort of makes sense for us. And so I want to kind of walk you through this, right? I always say this. Think of this as a day in a life of a helping professional, maybe someone with a role or a job similar to yours, right? You wake up, you come to work, you're right here, right? You encounter think of each one of these as kind of a stressor, maybe a difficult client, a difficult colleague, right? Some type of stressor at work. And as we encounter those, we become a little bit more distressed and a little bit more agitated, a little bit more dysregulated, right? And we're building up right here. We maybe take a lunch and we start to regulate a little bit, right? We go take a lunch, and then it kind of builds back up again as we get through the end of our day, right? And we can all kind of relate to that a little bit. And then I put another one up here for maybe somebody who already comes into work who's a little bit dysregulated. And we know that about half of mental health professionals and social workers and helping professionals are already here. And those same stressors kind of impact them a little bit more acutely, a little bit more, and they too get a break and they can regulate a little bit. And then it kind of builds back up again after they come back from their lunch break, right? And then all the way to the end of the day. And then hopefully at the end of the day, they can kind of disconnect a little bit, do some self-care, go exercise, go on a date, hang out with their friends, whatever it might be, right? Well, we know that more and more these days, especially for a lot of helping professionals, we know that that's not happening, that they're kind of taking the worry of in the stress of their work and even the emails of their work home with them, right? And I get that, right? I always give this example. I can remember being a child welfare worker, and spending the entire day trying to find a 15-year-old kid who had run away. And then, when you go off the clock at the end of the day, you don't just automatically stop thinking about that kid, right? Like our work, just the nature of our work, oftentimes it goes home with us. So, but what it means is that we never really fully get an opportunity to sort of regulate there. And so I want you to consider this one here, right? That if, and I want to use that same old attachment theory, right, to kind of explain this. So remember, I told you, right, that when a baby is born into this world, and everybody knew this coming into this today, and this is nothing new, right? Their brain activates the systems in wires for the world that they're going to live in based upon that template. Right? If there's a lot of love and nurture, it's going to activate those systems for a safe, loving, nurturing world. And if there's not, there's a lot of chaos and a lot of trauma, our brain's going to activate those systems. And again, every day, our brains kind of do that for us. And so if we're based upon our environment, if we're telling, right, our brain, hey, our world is nothing but stress in work and stress and trauma and stress and toxicity, our brain is going to activate those systems so that we can survive in that world. So what does that mean? It means that we have to fundamentally change, right, that template. So imagine now we're coming in, we're dealing with our first stressor here, and we're starting to build up, but now it's mid-morning, and now I'm going to do some mindfulness activities, or I'm going to go take a walk or go for a quick run, and I start to regulate a little bit more, and I come back and I start dealing with those stressors, and I build up, and now it's lunchtime, and I'm going to do an off-campus lunch with a colleague or a best friend or my partner, and we're promised that we're not going to talk about work, and I start to regulate again, and I get worked up again, and now this is going to be, a walk, right, where I go for a 20-minute walk, and I start to regulate a little bit more, and I become dysregulated, but I'm going to mark the end of the day now by, going out for drinks or going to get coffee, all of those sorts of, going to the gym, whatever works for us, right? Not only, we typically and historically, when we talk about self-care, we look at this as, oh yeah, we're regulating to deal with the stressors of our work. Sure, that's important. That's really, really important, but it's not the most important thing. What's more important here is that we're fundamentally changing that template for which our brain is going to wire these. We're basically telling our brain, hey, you don't need to wire for a world and for an environment that is nothing but stress and chaos and toxicity and trauma, right? Now, right, you need to also activate those systems, right? Because I'm building in some mindfulness, some exercise, some connections, some relationships, some self-care, right? And all of those sorts of things. And so it's fundamentally going to change those very systems that our brain is sort of wiring for. And I know I'm already out. I ran through this really, really fast. There are a couple more things I want to say. And even if we spend a little bit more time on this one, I can cut down the other ones a little bit. Actually, that's good. We'll stop there because I don't want to do too much, and I want to leave some time for some questions. So I know we've got some chat, or I don't know if we have some chat questions here. If we have any, feel free. We can take a couple of minutes and answer those before we go on to the next one. Are there any questions there, Ashley?
I am not seeing any right now.
Okay, so if there's not any questions, I do want to explain this really quick, right? So this just looks like a big sloppy figure. Like what is this, right? This is actually based on some of the Perry work that I think has some major relevance for us as it relates to burnout and secondary trauma, right? But he and everybody else talks so much now about the importance of relationships, and it makes sense if we're telling clients who experience trauma that the most important thing for you all to heal from this trauma is relationships and connection. There's just nothing quite like it. Then it's no different for us if we're experiencing those exact same symptoms and internal experiences. Right? That if we're going to heal from that and regulate from that, it's those relationships that are going to help us to do that. Right? And so this is based upon the work of Bruce Perry. But I want you to imagine that each one of these arrows kind of symbolizes an interaction. And he did a bunch of work with I think it was like a 10 to 12-year-old kids. And he looked at their average number of interactions, and these close arrows were like interactions with their loved ones or their family, and these other arrows were interactions with their friends, and then these out here were more kind of teachers and coaches, and then these were strangers or other people, right? But the idea here is that the more interactions that we have, the more of the right that relationships are regulating for us, that the more interactions that we have, especially positive interactions, we don't realize it, right? And we did during the pandemic, right? That as we lose those interactions, as we lose those relationships, we lose those opportunities to regulate, right? And the more healthy and supportive and affirming and positive interactions that we have, the healthier and the happier and the more regulated we're going to be. And then, of course, they do the same thing, and they look at this would be the average day of a kid in a foster group home, their interactions, and you can see that they're far fewer here. And so I put this up because, I think a lot of us are still kind of healing a little bit from, the effects of the pandemic, especially that year where we were kind of shut down, almost entirely shut down, and our worlds looked a lot more like this. Because I do a lecture quite frequently on everything that we can learn from teenagers in foster care. There's just so much that we can learn here, because we know that for a lot of these kids in foster care, right, emotional states become behavioral traits. And what happens is the longer that you live in worlds that look like this, the more that you're going to become accustomed to that, the more that your brain is going to kind of wire around that world, right? And for many of us during the pandemic, our worlds look like this. So we have to be especially intentional and strategic about trying to get our worlds to look a lot more like, and I know it's hard, right? But this is exactly why I've heard from students all year long. They said, Adam, I just feel like I'm not having the same pleasure from relationships, and I can't get motivated to connect. And you keep saying we need to go to, get coffee with our friends and hang out on campus and get together and go downtown and do all of these sorts of things. It's just, it's hard for me to do that. I don't have the same motivation. I don't feel like I'm getting the same joy from that. And I kept telling them over and over, that's perfectly normal, right? But the more that you do it, the more that it's going to kind of come back to you, and the more that your brain's going to wire around that a little bit more. You just got to be intentional and kind of push yourself to sort of do that. And by the end of the year, a lot of them were looked a lot more like this, and they were kind of bouncing back a little bit. But it's the same thing for us as helping professionals. If we're going to tell our clients that the way that you heal from trauma is through relationships, right? We do this with social workers, and it drives me crazy when it comes to, and I'll turn off my slideshow here. We say, well, you got to go do self-care, right? You got to take care of yourself and put together a self-care plan. Even if you go a little bit further, put together a self-care plan and let's go over it. Sure, that's helpful, but that's not it, right? That doesn't help for somebody to understand what's going on internally for them. We wouldn't go tell a client, like, I know you've dealt with a lot of trauma, you just got to take care of yourself, go put together a really good self-care plan. Sure, we're going to do that, but that's not even going to be the most important thing that we would do with them. We're going to say, hey, we need to change your environment, and we need to make it safer for you. And if you struggle to take care of yourself, we need to figure out what's going on there. Why is that so hard for you? I do a lecture on family heroes as social workers, people who grew up in family environments that were maybe unhealthy or even toxic or even abusive, and they create these hero roles, and it makes them a hell of a social worker, right? So they're so empathic, and so have so much emotionality, and do so much incredible work, and feel the feelings of people around them, and shoulder the weight of all of this work. But what they oftentimes struggle to do is take up any space at all. And for many of them, it's not that they can't express their needs or seek out their needs, it's that they have no idea how to even recognize what those needs are. And that's the case for a lot. So if we're saying, right, it's like teaching a kindergartner algebra. If we're saying, oh, you need to put together a self-care plan and implement that and enact that, and somebody has never truly experienced, right, or had the space and learned how to recognize what those needs are, let alone to actually create boundaries around their work and their relationships and prioritize themselves and all of those sorts of things, right? And not knowing what's going on in their brains and their bodies, right? We're really doing them a disservice, right? So that's a lot. That's not a lot of time. That's a lot of content. Any questions on that one? Who designed this model? It's Bruce Perry. That's all. Everything that we just talked about comes from Bruce Perry. You can find all of this work through the Child Trauma Academy. This actual model's in his newest book too. What Happened to You is what it's called. Oh, sorry, Natalie, talking too fast here. All right, we good to go on to the next one, Ashley?
Yes, sir.
All right. So here, this is LGBTQ plus youth in trafficking experiences. This is the wrong one, sorry. Give me just a second here. Let me find it here. Here we go. All right, I'll try to talk slower for you. So, we've done a lot of work in the state of Texas in the last 10 years or so around youth trafficking. Some incredible work. Many of you are probably involved in some different programs that address trafficking and have seen some of that work. But one thing that we haven't done as good of a job of is really addressing the needs of LGBTQI plus, and really acknowledging the fact that LGBTQI plus youth make up such a huge proportion of young people who experience trafficking, who have survived trafficking, and who are vulnerable to trafficking. And that's, for a variety of different reasons. I think a lot of them, when we look at, what's going on with the legislature and some of the kind of anti-LGBTQI plus bills and policies and executive orders and other things that have happened there, you can kind of get the sense that there's not a huge push or a lot of motivation to really create safe and affirming experiences for these young people. And kind of the same thing with foster care, because in fact, if we look at all of the young people who are trafficked in the state of Texas, anywhere between about 70 to 85% of them would either be youth out of the foster care system or LGBTQI plus youth. And many of them would actually be LGBTQI plus youth who have a history of foster care involvement. And I think we all know what's going on with the lawsuit right now, and the fact that the governor and the administration is really trying to deny the reality that we have some major issues in our foster care system. And that's been going on for well over a decade now. So the fact that we can't get folks to fully acknowledge who the populations are, especially the two most vulnerable groups, I think that's created a lot of issues and a lot of problems when it comes to actually intervening with some of these trafficking initiatives. So what I want to do in this conversation is talk a little bit about why LGBTQI plus youth are so vulnerable to trafficking, especially youth out of the foster care system, and especially homeless young people. So here's a couple of numbers, just like the last one. I'll frame these a little bit. About 60 to 75% of youth trafficking victims have a history of child welfare involvement. About 85% of youth trafficking victims have a history of homelessness. Homelessness is the biggest risk factor for trafficking. LGBTQ plus homelessness when compared to non-LGBTQ plus homeless young people are about twice as likely to report trafficking experiences. And this one's interesting. This is some national data from the Urban Institute, but in their study, 1 in 3 LGBTQ plus youth who were homeless had reported that they were approached or contacted or had some type of interaction with somebody who was a trafficker or working with a trafficker within about 2 days of being homeless. We've long known that LGBTQI plus youth are more vulnerable to every single form of childhood maltreatment that we measure, of course, with family violence being the most prominent or most prevalent one. LGBTQ plus kids, depending on what study we look at, are anywhere between 3 to 5 times as likely to experience violence from a family member than non-LGBTQI plus young people. And we're still seeing about 1/3, despite all of the changes that we've seen in becoming a little bit more accepting and affirming as a society, about 1/3 of LGBTQ plus homeless youth experienced physical or sexual abuse or psychological abuse at the time of their exit, either if they ran away or they were kicked out or there was something else going on. They went into the foster care system, whatever the reason, whatever happened to them, about 1/3 of them were experiencing some form of abuse there. So given those high rates of childhood maltreatment, it's certainly no surprise that we would see higher rates of mental illness. Of course, with PTSD and depression being the most prevalent. LGBTQ plus youth still about 3 to 4 times more likely to meet clinical criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder than non-LGBTQ plus youth, and about twice as likely or 2.5 times as likely to meet clinical criteria for depression. And of course, given those higher rates of PTSD, more vulnerability to maltreatment, higher rates of depression, we're still seeing significantly higher rates of suicide and suicidality by LGBTQI plus young people. And 1 in 3 teens who dies by suicide this year will be an LGBTQ plus young person. I always say, and a lot of us just finished June and probably attended some Pride events and took some opportunities to think about all of the gains that we've seen in acceptance and affirmation when it comes to LGBTQI plus young people in particular, and a lot more representation in media in all of those sorts of things. But at the same time, what we haven't seen is we haven't seen a fundamental shift in the number of kids coming into the foster care system, right? Still 1 in 3 teens in the foster care system are LGBTQ plus teens. Homelessness, about half of all youth who are homeless, 44%, are LGBTQ plus young people, teens or young adults. Juvenile justice, overrepresentation, trafficking, overrepresentation, suicidality, overrepresentation. So we're not necessarily seeing much change there. And as a researcher who's been doing research with LGBTQ kids in the foster care system for 13 years, going on 14 years now, it's comes down to a lot of young people are still dealing with a lot of family rejection, a lot of hostility. Still fewer than half of LGBTQ plus kids who are out in what they would consider to be affirming and accepting family environments. And so there's still a lot of work to be done here. And I mentioned family acceptance because family acceptance is the most prominent and most robust predictor of the mental health and the behavioral health of LGBTQI plus young people. There was an incredibly seminal study that was done about 10 years ago. It's called the Family Acceptance Study. Many of you are probably familiar with this study. It kind of spurred the creation of something called the Family Acceptance Project. And this team of researchers set out to really better understand the relationship between family rejection and the adverse mental health and behavioral health outcomes that we know so much about with LGBTQI plus young people: suicide, depression, risky sex, risky substance abuse, and a couple of other outcomes. And they didn't want to just simply replicate that study one more time, but they wanted to kind of look at a young person's experiences with their families and kind of assess their family's level of acceptance or rejection and see what role that kind of played in predicting their risk for suicide or depression or risky sex or risky substance abuse. And so they did that. They gave young people a series of questions and asked them about their experiences with their parents or their caregivers growing up. How did they respond when you came out? How likely were they to connect you with pride groups? How did they communicate when it came to your identity? How did they deal with romantic relationships, extracurricular activities, all of those sorts of things? And based upon responses to those questions, every young person in that study was given an acceptance score. And those acceptance scores ranged from very accepting all the way down to very rejecting. And then they took those scores and looked at suicide, depression, risky sex, risky substance abuse. And what they found was that, in fact, those young people who had very accepting families were 8 times less likely to attempt suicide during childhood than those young people who had very rejecting families. In fact, family acceptance is the most protective factor to reducing the risk of suicide for LGBTQ plus kids. Same thing with depression. Those young people who had very accepting families were 6 times less likely to meet clinical criteria for major depressive disorder. Family acceptance, the most robust predictor, right, or protective factor when it comes to youth depression for LGBTQ plus kids. Risky substance abuse, 3.5 times less likely for those with very accepting families to engage in risky substance abuse than those with very rejecting families. And 3.5 times less likely to engage in risky sex than those with very rejecting families. That family acceptance was one of the most important or the most important buffer when it came to these mental health outcomes and behavioral health outcomes that we've known a lot about for a long time. But it's not just kind of comparing those young people with high rejection to those with high acceptance. And that's kind of what this chart does here. You can look on the right here. This would be the risk of suicide attempt for those young people who had really rejecting or highly rejecting families as compared to those with highly accepting families. Some of you would look at this and say, well, that's helpful, sure, but many of the families that I work with, because of their theological views or ideological views or personal convictions or whatever it might be, that it would be very difficult for them to be very accepting. They're probably not going to have the same rules when it comes to relationships, or not engage in double standards, or they're not going to be leading the pride parade and some of those sorts of things. And you're right. But for a lot of those families,
real quick, sorry to interrupt. Your slides aren't showing right now.
Oh no, I cannot believe that. I am so sorry.
No worries.
All right, how about now?
Yes, better.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So over here, whoops. There we go. So over here on the right would be those young people, right, who have very rejecting families. This would be their risk for suicide. They're 8 times more likely to attempt suicide than somebody who's all the way over here on the far left, who has a very accepting family. But right here would be a family who's kind of somewhere in the middle, right? They're maybe not as accepting as we might hope, and they're not at the PFLAG meeting or leading the pride parade, and they still have some work to do when it comes to communication. But overall, they're kind of accepting of their young person's identity. They're talking openly about it, right? They're somewhere in the middle here. And if you can take a family who's over here and work with them through family counseling and psychoeducation and all of those sorts of things, what we do is we reduce that young person's risk of suicide 4 times. All right. Same thing when we look at illegal substance, right? Or dangerous substance use and abuse. Highly rejecting, right? Their risk is cut in half if we can get them to moderately accepting, if that sort of makes sense. And we could do this for every one of these outcomes, but we kind of get it here, right? That family acceptance becomes really, really important. But we know, especially in a state like Texas, that there's still certainly a majority of LGBTQ plus young people who are growing up in environments that are not affirming and accepting. So because of that, the tension that they have with their families, the hostility that they have with the families, the rejection, the risk of the vulnerability to abuse, emotional abuse, all of those sorts of things, that for many of them, that can be a huge risk factor for other things, including trafficking, right? In fact, when we look at some of the biggest risk for trafficking amongst LGBTQ plus young people, right? Housing instability and homelessness, that's one of the biggest ones, right? When a young person becomes homeless, they become incredibly more likely to be trafficked, right? Like, so, yeah, I think the data is something like 35 times more likely to be trafficked if you're homeless than if you're not homeless, right? Young people, obviously, who experience family rejection, young people who have an extensive history of trauma. We know that with trafficking now. We know that most young trafficking survivors have very complex trauma histories. Having a child welfare involvement, right, being in the foster care system, and then having a lack of social support, right? So right here, we know LGBTQ young people, right, significantly more likely to have a complex trauma history, 3 times more likely to be involved in the child welfare system, the foster care system. Once they come into the foster care system, 7 times more likely to be in group homes and congregate care settings, which also can be a big risk factor for trafficking. And then the final one here is a lack of a support system. And when we look at the research on support system sizes, right, without comparing LGBTQ plus youth to non-LGBTQ plus youth, on average, their support systems are about half as big. And if they have a family that is rejecting, right, their support systems are even smaller in many, and for many of them, they have almost no support system. So if we were to take that and we were to look at what we know about the grooming tactics, right, the things that we know that traffickers are doing to recruit and to groom and to control young people, right, what oftentimes happens is their experiences not only with their family of origin, especially if that family is very rejecting or even abusive, but their families have, in a sense, kind of done a lot of that grooming for the traffickers already, right? They've already had a lot of trauma. They're already isolated from their family. They already have a small support system and few people who that they can trust and rely on. They're less safe. And traffickers know that. They're able they're incredibly strategic and intentional about who they target as victims in their coercive control and grooming tactics here, right? So here more broadly, these are some of the common tactics that we see by traffickers, right? And you're almost universally going to see this one. And there are a lot of people in this room that do trafficking work, and you see this one all the time, right? Offering a sense of family and a sense of community. And again, this is going to be much more effective for a young person who doesn't have a family, who's disconnected from their family, who's isolated from their family or from their foster family, and isolated from their community, right? Because when a young person is kicked out of their home, or they run away from their home, or they're homeless, or they go into the foster care system, or they're couch surfing, right? They're not only separated from their family, but in many ways, they're also separated from their community, right? So offering a sense of family and a sense of community is going to be much more of an effective tactic for a young person who doesn't have that. Offering to meet a young person's needs to build a sense of trust and dependency. Again, this is going to be a lot easier if a young person doesn't have people that they can trust and that they can depend and rely upon. And then the last one here, offering a sense of safety and a sense of protection. And again, if you're not safe, right, because your family has failed to keep you safe, because the foster care system has failed to keep you safe, because you're not safe on the streets, all right, that sense of safety and that sense of protection is going to be a lot more effective. But it's not just that. There are some more micro strategies and tactics that we see all the time from traffickers and people working with traffickers, right? They do an incredibly effective job at trauma bonding and in kind of feeding off these dynamics of normalized trauma and normalized violence. This is why, part of the reason why kids with complex, especially sexual trauma experiences, are so much more vulnerable to trafficking, because these traffickers know exactly what they're doing to exploit that. And they know exactly what they're doing to exploit those trauma bonds and build those trauma bonds to work off the normalized violence and the normalized trauma that they know that they're going to ask these kids to endure. And in many ways, the trauma and the violence they perpetrate themselves on these young people, exploiting intimate disclosures. Well, you can imagine, with kids who have a complex trauma history, with a lot of LGBTQ plus kids who have had to hide or conceal aspects of their identity, right? This has been normalized in many ways for a lot of them. These next ones, I think these oftentimes go overlooked, right? But the strategic use of humiliation and shame and degradation. I'm doing a study right now with trafficking survivors out of the foster care system, and I'm looking just at what their experiences look like, right? How their traffickers strategically use shame and humiliation and degradation, and how they talk to them, and the things that they said to them, and the coercive control and the gaslighting and all of those sorts of experiences. But again, for a lot of these kids, in their families of origins, in their foster families, in their group homes, these things have already been normalized for them in many ways. If you grew up in a family, right, where you experienced so much shame and so much humiliation around your identity and who you loved and who you are, this is going to be something that you're going to be a lot more vulnerable to in a lot of instances, creating a dynamic of distrust, strategic trauma bonding, right? And I've listed out a bunch more here. We don't have to go through all of these, but you can kind of get a sense here of what would make LGBTQ plus kids out of the foster care system, kids with a complex trauma history, so much more vulnerable to all of these sorts of experiences. This is some data that just came out recently. I just wanted to throw it in here because I thought it was really, really important. But when we look at LGBTQI plus homeless youth, they're about 7.5 times as likely as non-LGBTQ plus homeless youth to experience some form of sexual violence in their childhood. So again, kind of getting at that normalized sexual violence here, but just normalized trauma in general. And I think it's important for us to really better study and better understand. This is something that I get really frustrated with, because I think even a lot of people who are doing or wanting to do a lot more work with trafficking survivors, they're not exposed and they're not taught about all of the different tactics and strategies and things that traffickers and perpetrators are doing, right? Especially on a more micro scale. Sure, we all kind of know, yeah, I'm sure that they're doing something to build on trauma bonds, and I'm sure they're doing something to create a sense of trust and a sense of family. But we need to understand it, I think, a little bit more on a micro level, and then understand why the specific populations that we're working with, given their experiences of adversity and trauma, are so much more vulnerable to those sorts of things. These, I'm going to skip through a couple of these. I do want to talk about LGBTQI plus youth in the child welfare system here, because we know that there's a huge overrepresentation of LGBTQ kids in the foster care system, and many or most of those kids will become homeless or experience homeless either while they're still teenagers, and over half of them will experience homelessness as young adults as they transition out of the foster care system. And in their experiences in the foster care system oftentimes look fundamentally different than non-LGBTQI plus young people, right? They're significantly less likely to be reunited with their families once they come into care. They oftentimes come into care at a much older age. We see fewer and fewer of them being placed with kinship relatives, because oftentimes their kinship families, their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles have many of the same ideological or religious convictions or beliefs that are at odds with acceptance and affirmation that their parents, their immediate family had. And so we're, we the way that we kind of think about kinship care as being blood family, we don't think about, hey, my family is really my best friend's parents or my teacher, right? We're doing a better job of that in child welfare, but historically we haven't done a very good job of how we define kinship care and kinship families and kinship providers there. So oftentimes what we're finding is child welfare professionals aren't being as intentional about seeking out some of those people to be potential caretakers for these young people. So they're more likely to come into care. Once they come into care, much less likely to be placed in a long-term foster family. Oftentimes because we don't, of course we have a shortage of foster families right now just in general, but we have a critical shortage of families who are able and equipped to provide accepting and affirming care. So what happens is they tend to bounce around families. They have a lot more placements, on average about 7 placements, and they're significantly more likely to end up in congregate care or group home placements. And I understand the need for it. My wife and I were house parents at a children's home for several years in another lifetime, 20 years ago. But typically a congregate care or a group home placement is supposed to be based upon a young person's, emotional and behavioral needs, right? They need that sense of structure. And for what a lot of LGBTQI plus young people, especially here in Texas, where we rely on group home congregate care settings more than any other state in the United States, what happens is a lot of LGBTQ plus young people are in congregate care settings, not because their emotional or behavioral needs warrant that, but because there's really no family available for them, right? And the problem with that is, well, there's a lot of problems with that, right? Once a young person goes to a group home or congregate care setting, it really intensifies their vulnerability for a range of more adverse and negative outcomes. They're more likely to be homeless, more likely to be incarcerated, more likely to have an unplanned pregnancy, more likely to not go to college, all of these, more likely to be trafficked, and there's a whole bunch more incarcerated, whole bunch more of negative outcomes where young people in group homes experience at disproportionately high rates when compared to young people in traditional foster families, right? So it's problematic for those reasons, but it's especially problematic for a lot of LGBTQI plus young people because it kind of reinforces that same sense of rejection that they experienced with their family of origin, that you don't belong in a family, right? I'm doing some studies right now, some qualitative studies to kind of better try to understand that the impact of that on young people. And this is the last thing I'll say on this one, but this is a study that I just wrapped up during the pandemic, and is a small study, only 47 young people, but these are LGBTQI plus young people who lived in the foster care system and who had trafficking experiences either while they were in the system or after they left the system. And you can see some of the demographic data here and some of the other data. 90% of them had experiences of family rejection with their family of origin. About 3/4 of them family rejection in the foster care system. They had about 6 placements on average, and almost all of them, or 78% of them, their primary living environment while they were in care was a group home or a congregate care placement. So when we look at some of the strategies and some of the tactics in working with LGBTQI plus young people, is we really want to understand that sense of survival, right? And we know this from trauma. So much of trauma is rooted in safety and survival, and good trauma-informed care is recognizing that survival-related experiences and survival-related emotions that young people experience in the aftermath of that trauma are going to elicit survival-related behavior. And so some of the behaviors that we see from young people, even some of the ones that have historically been seen to be adverse or dysfunctional or problematic in some way, are actually pretty resilient, right? Young people who maybe run away from their family are running away from an environment that is toxic or abusive. They're taking up space, they're standing up for themselves, they have some, some recognition of their worth and their value. We want to understand that, with any population, but especially with LGBTQI plus young people, is the more that they experience trauma, the more trauma triggers that they're going to have, right? And for many LGBTQ plus young people, because of their vulnerability to abuse, especially sexual violence and physical abuse and emotional abuse, as well as their vulnerability to those chronic stressors, especially of family rejection or housing instability, homelessness, that they have very complex trauma experiences. So they're going to have a range of different triggers and reminders and stressors in those environments. I'm going to talk about this dynamic in our last talk, so I'll hold off on that one. More structurally or systemically, one of the things that we could really do that I think would make a big dent and a big improvement with LGBTQ plus young people in the foster care system is to really expand the way that we think about kinship. Can we be more intentional about connecting these young people with loved ones in people in their support system, and prevent them from coming into the foster care system, right? Because we know that their experiences in the foster care system typically tend to cause more harm than good for them. Could we better allocate some of those resources? If they have a teacher at school that they're really close with, or if their best friend's parents are somebody that they're really close with, can we possibly, really tap into those resources to prevent kids from coming into care in the first place? Yeah, and I've listed it. You take a look at these. We only got 30 minutes, so we don't have too much time to look, at all of these. But some of these I think are some pretty helpful intervention strategies. Yeah. So, all right, we're through another one quick. What kind of questions do you all have on this one? I'll open up the chat here. Any questions? Did I slow down enough for you there on that one, Natalie? Still talking a little fast. All right. Are you seeing any questions, Ashley?
Not seeing any.
All right. Let's go on to the last one. I'll make sure to share my screen on time on this one. All right, addressing masculinity. Okay, give me a second here so I can share my screen. Lost it here. All right. Is it up, Ashley?
Yes, all looks good.
All right, last one. We're almost done, guys. All right, this is another issue that I think I wish we talked about a little bit more, especially in a more meaningful sort of way. And I hope that there's some relevance here for the work that you all are doing, right? And I want to do this in a way that's very, very sensitive. I know that this is a topic that the way that folks engage this can really either kind of stifle conversation and dialogue or can really stimulate that. So I'm going to try to do my best to just try to hit on the things that I think are going to be helpful for us here and try not to be offensive in any way at all. But I do want to talk about the impact of masculinity and especially hyper masculinity and in some of these more extreme expectations and norms and pressures that we tend to kind of police young men with. In how we can engage that in our work. This is a guide that I encourage you to take a look at. The APA put this together a couple of years back, and it's really fantastic. And I know that NASW is putting together one as well that focuses a little bit more on some of those environmental experiences and norms. But if I were to pose this question to you all, and we definitely don't have time to do something a little bit more interactive, typically that's what I would do here. But I just want you to think about this and kind of, catalog this or write down some ideas or type down some ideas if you're in front of your computer or you have a sheet of paper there, right? But are there, because I think all of us think that there can be a point where masculinity, right, and these norms and these expectations and these pressures around masculinity can become especially unhealthy or harmful, right? The word that folks used to use was toxic. And I think people realize that that's probably not the most effective word to stimulate a conversation, right? Is to use toxic masculinity, right? But maybe harmful masculinity here, right? So I'll give you an example. One that I oftentimes hear from social workers and from teachers is that they feel like masculinity becomes harmful when a young person feels like they can't express any emotions, especially sadness or fear, right? That might be the point at which masculinity can be harmful. And there are a whole different range of things that I oftentimes hear. Some people will say it becomes harmful when young people feel like there's a hierarchy and that boys or men, right, are better than girls or females or have certain feel like they should have certain access to relationships or other sorts of things. Self-care is one that I've been hearing a lot more, that for a lot of young men or a lot of men, that taking care of themselves and self-care, getting counseling or can be harmful. Vulnerability, putting themselves out there a little bit, expressing fear, sadness, crying. Those would all be examples. I think that many of us would agree that a point at which masculinity becomes harmful or unhealthy. And I'm sure if we had time, and we definitely don't, but if we had time, we could probably rattle off a whole bunch of these, right? And folks are always able to sort of do that, right? And the reason that I mention this is that I think it's important that we really understand, right, that point at which, right, why so many young people grow up in families or environments or worlds that they feel so much pressure to ascribe to these unhealthy forms of or harmful forms of masculinity, right? So we have to really understand what that is and where does that sort of come from, and what are the implications or the potential consequences of that. And Carolyn Heldman's a researcher out in California, and she's done a lot of work on the relationship between masculinity and violence. In fact, we're going to look at some research later on that shows that young people who have higher levels of kind of masculine, hyper-masculine conformity, high levels of risk-taking behavior and high levels of power and control and dominance and, lower levels of emotional maturity and those sorts of things are much more likely to perpetuate intimate partner violence, dating violence, child abuse, child violence, those sorts of things, right? But in her work, she has this quote that I think is really, really helpful, and I think a good starting place on this conversation. She says that we raise boys to become men whose very identity is based on rejecting the feminine, and then we're surprised when they fundamentally disrespect women. And so I want to kind of break this out into two pieces here. I want to start with this first piece. We raise boys to become men whose very identity is based on rejecting the feminine. And here she's kind of saying, right, that from an early age for a lot of boys and a lot of young men, whether it's intentional or not, the messages that they're getting, either from their family, from the world, from entertainment, from society, from school, from sports, is that, right, their identity is rooted in rejecting those things in this world, in their life, that are deemed to be feminine, right? An example of this that I grew up with, I grew up in a very hyper-masculine home. My dad was an incredibly hyper-masculine person. But, a rule for me growing up was you don't cry because crying is for girls. Right? And this is still really common. Our family was just at our community pool the other day, and a little boy, probably 7 or 8 years old, started crying. He's playing with his friends and his sibling, and his dad just yelled out, "Quit crying like a girl," right? Like, this is still really, really common message that a lot of boys receive here, right? You don't cry like a girl, right? And so if we think about, and this is where I think this becomes really, really important. What are those things that we in society have kind of deemed to be feminine that many boys and many young men in turn will grow up to reject? And as we think about these, we realize very quickly that there are some really important things that we kind of deem to be feminine, right? Emotional expression, right? Expressing fear or sadness or shame, right? Those are things that we deem to be feminine. Vulnerability, that's something that we deem to be feminine. Empathy, connection, relationships, nurture, caregiving, right? Then if you were to think about other things like careers or majors or certain toys or extracurricular activity, there are all of these sorts of things. And as we think about those, especially those more interpersonal ones like emotional expression and vulnerability and connection and empathy and relationships, what do we know about these things? We know, especially us as social workers and helping professionals and counselors and crisis workers, we know that those are the very things that are most important, that we absolutely need, that are essential to our health, our mental health, and our well-being. And for many boys and for many young men, they grow up in worlds where the message is, even if it's not intentional, is that vulnerability and connection and caregiving and empathy and compassion and relationships and emotional expression are for girls. They're not for me. And many of them, it's policed at a much more severe level, right? Like, as she says, rejecting the feminine. I know in my world, growing up with my family, my environment, it wasn't just rejecting, but having this absolute disdain for those things that were considered to be feminine, right? And so as we think about that, what are the potential consequences in terms of the mental health, the behavioral health, the relationship health of boys and young men? And then when we look at the second half of this quote, right, we raise boys to become men whose very identity is based on rejecting the feminine, and then we're surprised when they grow up to fundamentally disrespect women. And I would add to this, disrespect women and anyone who has the courage to deviate from this. So we talk about LGBTQ plus young people, we talk about non-binary kids, we talk about kids who just want to embrace vulnerability or empathy or connection or compassion, right? Interests or activities that are outside of these really rigid expectations. And so as we think about that, I mean, think about this, if we raise boys, right, to generate or to create this identity that is so deeply rooted in rejecting everything that has been feminized or deemed to be feminine. None of those things are feminine. They're all essential. We need them, right? But if we raise them to have this disdain or to reject these things, my question is, what are we teaching them about girls? And what are we teaching them about women, right? And what are we teaching them about anyone who deviates from these rigid expectations? And what role does that then play in these incredibly high, rates of things like dating violence, bullying, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual assault and rape. But even beyond those violent experiences, when we think about what we continue to see with, the experiences of women in the workplace, we look at the data on the glass ceiling, we still see these huge barriers, right, to upward mobility in the workplace. We think about the glass ceiling data, 78 cents for every dollar, right? How do we value, right? And what role does this sort of play in how women are valued and respected in other, right? How they're treated in their relationships or their marriages, in all of those sorts of things. So I think, in my opinion, this is a really helpful kind of quote to help us to begin to think about where these unhealthy or these harmful forms of masculinity come from, right? And if we know that for many boys and many men, they grow up in environments. I think about my own son. Right? He's got a dad, right, who's a social worker who does trauma work and masculinity work. His mom is a feminist, she's a feminist community organizer and professor. And even still, especially as he gets older, he's 14, he's going into high school this year, right? The older that he gets, and the more, right? And of course, we all know this, as you become a teenager and you go to middle school and you go to high school, your peer group becomes a lot more important to you. It's all evolutionary, right? And your family become, right? You hope that they hold on to those sort of values, but for him, it's almost like you just see these two worlds collide right in front of you. And it's like, hey, what a good example. When he started playing basketball several years ago, he was a little guy, and he's played basketball ever since, and has gotten pretty good over the years. But when he first started playing, I remember he had a coach who was really good, but he was really loud. And I remember Aiden was probably 8 or 9 years old, and the coach yelled, "Aiden, you got to man up." And Aiden just looked up to my wife and I in the crowd, like, he's like, "We don't man up. We're not supposed to do that." I said, "No, it's a different kind of man. This one's okay. Like, it just means to stand in front of that kid, right, and give him a hard time." But it was kind of a foreshadowing of what was to come over the course of the next several years, where his environment was going to start look so fundamentally different, especially being so immersed in the sports world, than maybe some of the values and some of the things that we taught him, right? And so we had to do a lot of work with him to help him to kind of navigate, what I call your moral compass, when your head and your heart are at odds with one another, when you know what's the right thing to do versus what is the popular thing to do. And so we got to help kids to navigate that. When we look at the mental health experiences, what we're seeing more and more amongst boys, unfortunately, we're having this conversation at a much larger level, especially as it relates to depression. But when we see PTSD and we see depression and anxiety manifest in boys and young men, right, it's going to manifest in much more externalized ways, right? Because if you've been socialized your whole life, right, to express things in these externalized ways, it's going to come out in those ways, right? So a lot of that shame, a lot of that fear, a lot of that sadness, a lot of that trauma, a lot of that vulnerability is going to come out as anger or violence or defiance or the class clown or substance use and abuse, hypersexuality, and all of these sorts of things. And we don't typically think about those being, especially with depression and anxiety, we don't think about those behaviors when we think about depression. We think about insomnia or hypersomnia, isolation, and those things will come, sure. But when it comes to depression, traumatic stress responses, all of those sorts of things, you're going to see a lot more anger, defiance, impulsivity, suicide attempts, substance use, substance abuse, than you're going to anything else there. Same thing when we talk about trauma. Many of you are familiar with trauma-informed care, and one of the foundational things that we teach in trauma-informed care, right, is you always want to understand internally what's going on with a young person, so that we can better understand their external behaviors. And all of the behaviors related to trauma and traumatic stress fall under two categories, right? Hyperarousal behaviors and dissociative behaviors. And what we know is, right, what largely tends to predict those behaviors is how a young person initially responded during their trauma, right? Remember, the hallmark feature of childhood traumatic stress is you're re-experiencing the same thoughts, emotions, and memories that you experienced during the initial trauma, right? So if during an initial trauma, I experienced a sense of, a young person experienced a sense of fear or sadness or anger or shame, and they tried to fight or tried to flee and had a hyperarousal response, it would then make sense that in the aftermath of that, in the weeks, the months, even the years later, when they re-experience not only those same memories and those same flashbacks, but as they re-experience those same internal experiences, those same emotions, the same fear or shame or sadness or anger, they're going to respond in a very similar way. Well, what do we know about the trauma experiences of boys and men? They're significantly more likely to have a hyperarousal response, right? It's about a 2-to-1 scenario when we compare cisgender boys to cisgender girls when it comes to hyperarousal trauma responses. We've known this research for 8 years now. And so even when a young person is experiencing traumatic, right, when they're stressed or they're triggered, they're re-experiencing those symptoms, they're going to re-experience a lot of those hyperarousal symptoms: hypervigilance, impulsivity, aggression, can't sit still, right? Irritability, all of those sorts of things. And of course, with females, they're 2-to-1 with the dissociative symptomology. And again, you can trace that back to their experiences with dissociation during that trauma, creating this psychological distance between themselves and what they're experiencing. And all of this, of course, relates to those more acute forms of trauma and traumatic stress. I don't think we know enough at this point to really better understand some of those manifestations as a result of the chronic stress. Remember things like poverty and homelessness, or at least I haven't seen that work at this point. So it's no wonder that we would see suicide rates vary so much, especially as young people get older into late adolescence here, right? And this is about 5 years old, this graph. We know that adolescence goes much later than this now. But you can see here, this is where we tend to start seeing suicide amongst young people as early as age 10, right? But even in that young early adolescent group, 10 to 14, suicide rates, death by suicide rates, 3 times higher for boys than girls. Mid-adolescence, 5 times higher. And then late adolescence, college age, young adult age, 7 times higher, right? And there's a whole range of reasons for for this, but it's not just what we typically think about. We typically say, well, yeah, boys are much more likely to use highly lethal means, and that is absolutely true when it comes to attempting suicide. But I don't think it's just that. I think for a lot of boys and a lot of young men, there's a lot going on there. Many of them are unable, right, to recognize, let alone deal with or process or understand these internal experiences of shame and sadness and fear and anxiety and a loss of control. And, if you can't understand it, you can't acknowledge it, obviously you're not going to be able to seek out any level of help. And even when they do, what we know from the data is boys are significantly less likely to seek out help. Fewer than half of all boys who have a major mental health, so that's PTSD, depression, suicidal ideations, and there's another one that is slipping my mind here, I just can't think of it, will ever seek out any type of help. And this isn't just seek out help from a mental health professional. This is seeking out help from a friend, a sibling, a parent, a neighbor, a teammate, a classmate, right? This is seeking out help in any way at all. 3 boys die by suicide every day. Second leading cause of death. And I know I'm running out of time again here, and I do want to leave some time at the end for questions. This will be the last thing that I'll talk about here. I think it's important, especially for helping professionals, social workers, frontline workers, to teachers, educators, to really understand that for a lot of boys, it is risky to deviate from these norms. This is a study from Harvard Public Health School. It's a couple years old now, but I think it has a lot of relevance. 2013. What they found was that those young adult males who had low levels of what they called gender conformity. So these aren't trans kids. These aren't necessarily even non-binary kids. These are just kids who didn't have high levels of masculine conformity in terms of especially external things like how they dressed, how they wore their clothes, or, what their extracurricular hobbies and interests and activities were, friend groups, some of that hyper competitive, high ascribing high to power and control, all of those sorts of things, right? Kids who just deviated from that were significantly vulnerable to victimization, all forms of victimization, bullying, sexual violence, physical violence, social isolation, when compared to those young people who had more moderate or high levels of masculine conformity there. And so it's important to recognize that for a lot of young people, it's risky. It's risky for them. So I want to go to just some suggestions, practice recommendations for us. We have to be intentional to engage in those conversations. So I do masculinity groups in youth prisons and foster group homes. And I ask boys this question all the time, right? Or ask them, where did you learn about what it means to be a boy or what it means to be a man? And have you ever had a meaningful conversation about that? And I never have anybody who say, yeah, I did. It just doesn't happen. These conversations aren't having them. So we need to be intentional to make sure that we have. Talk about those pressures, challenges, and complexities of boyhood and masculinity. Help give them the language for their inner experiences, and we can't assume that somebody else is doing that. Recognize that emotions like fear, sadness, vulnerability, and shame oftentimes manifest in externalized ways. They come out as silliness and anger. Provide a place to discuss things that has been feminized, things like connection and vulnerability and compassion and empathy and nurture and all of those things that so many boys don't get to foster or don't get to embrace about themselves. Help them to further engage their moral compass when it comes to speaking up and doing the right thing, especially when it comes to bullying, violence against women, LGBTQ plus violence, those sorts of things. Help them to recognize that their own status should never outweigh the safety or the humanity of someone else. And then I've got a couple more here that you can sort of look at, but I know that went by fast. So any last questions here? Somebody reference the Man Enough. Yeah, that's a good one. A podcast called Man Enough with the actor Justin Baldoni. Yeah, that's a really good one. There's also a documentary that is really fantastic. You can get it on, I think, Amazon, called The Mask You Live In. Check those out. Somebody linked that Man Enough podcast. That's a really good one. Emily says, I'm doing suicide screenings on children that come into the hospital. It's so hard when I come across the kiddos who are clearly in homes where they cannot be themselves. Yeah, and it's just so many kids, and so many of these issues related to masculinity, LGBTQ plus identity are really at the core of that. And I think we have absolutely no idea. We have just scratched the surface on the mental health consequences of that, of being in a home that's rejecting, or being in a home where you can't truly embrace those parts of yourself and your identity. It's incredibly damaging and harmful. Great point, Emily. Yeah, good question, Michaela. Michaela asked, how do we explain this? You got to meet people where they're at. And I think one of the biggest mistakes, and I've been doing especially family acceptance work for 15 years now in schools and in communities. And it's taken a long time to find the right way to do that. And I used to be, oftentimes use language that was way above family members and use language that they just were nowhere near, or ideas or concepts that they were nowhere near ready to embrace. So I think at the heart of this, and in social work, we teach this on the first day of social work class, is that what's core to social work is truly meeting people where they're at, right? So really having a good baseline of where they're at as it relates to family, LGBTQ identity, masculinity, right? And once we understand exactly where they're at, use the language and the concepts and the ideas and the interventions and the stories and the analogies that are going to make the most sense for them, right? So, I'm definitely not going to do a talk with a parent who's really kind of struggling to not, I think about my own dad, right? If somebody were to come in and say, oh, gender's a construct, gender's socially constructed, right? I mean, he would run out the room at that point. It's just not right. Whereas if I'm teaching a sociology class at St. Edward's, of course I'm going to say that, because it is, right? So, yeah, we got to meet people where they're at. Do you see parents and new generations being more open? Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially young parents now. Not everybody, but yeah, young parents now, I think, are so much more open to this. I think they're so much aware of the potential harm that this can cause on their kids and their mental health. So yeah, I definitely think there's a generational shift here. And I think the other thing, there are just so many. I know I'm out of time here. There are just so many misconceptions that shut down this conversation, right? You start saying, hey, we gotta start talking about transformative masculinity and healthy masculinity, and people hear that and they say, well, you hate trucks and football, and it's not it at all. I watch football every Sunday, all Sunday long, and there are a lot of things that are deemed kind of masculine that'll, it's about really hyper focusing on those things like emotional expression and vulnerability and connection and relationships, and weeding out all of the other nonsense that shuts down these conversations. It really drives me crazy. Yeah, that's good to hear, Casey. A lot of education going on in rural parts of the state. That's good. Yeah, and you got to meet people where they're at, right? And that's good to know. Other questions, comments? We are out of time. We're right at 2:30. That went fast. Sorry, Ashley.
Yeah, no, that was great. If anyone has any other questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll go ahead and just kind of wrap up a little bit. Thanks, Adam, so much for doing our first short stack. I think it was really informative, and a lot of people, I think, got a lot out of it. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. Take care.
Yes. You will get the information after this to fill out for CEUs or certificates of completion. So be sure to be on the lookout for that. And next week we have a GU that either is virtual or on campus, our first GU event. So if you'd like to join us, please make sure to get on our website and sign up for that. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.